And we are back on the Fowler Show. And we're going to have a conversation. There's been so many late breaking developments on Syria, and I'm pretty and let's be honest and real. And by the time you heard this show, there might be more late breaking developments about what's going down in Syria. But we'll give you sort of where we are right now. And at this point in time, as we tape right now, there's negotiations happening between the Russians and the Russian Foreign Minister and the Secretary of State, John Kerry. Joining me to talk about it and sort of talk about where we are as we were, different from last week, where we are right now, is producer and political analyst of the Richard Fowler Show, Rich Webster.
Richard Fowler.
How are you?
I am well.
Good.
So, what do you got, Richard?
Well, there's some interesting stories here, and I think, at the end of the day, no matter what happens, I think this one thing remains the same. Jen Psaki, who we've had on the show before, who's now the spokesman of the State Department, said the following. That, finding and securing the Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles amid a bloody civil war will be a daunting and lengthy task, making it, even more difficult for us to sort of get to some sort of resolution on this.
I think you're right on that point, and one thing that has just been so amazing to me throughout the course of this, and we talked about this last week, is there was a definite, palpable tension this entire time between Russia and Vladimir Putin and President Obama, and there are a lot of moving parts, and it seems like that Putin called Obama's bluff.
You see, I don't necessarily and this is where I sort of disagree.
Maybe
just
not.
a tad.
No, maybe not Obama's, but definitely John Kerry's. Because in John Kerry's speech, he basically said in a mocking, see if they'll try to do this tone, yeah, as long as they just turn over, all of their chemical weapons, that'll never happen. And then Putin comes to the table with, hey, I've got an idea. This is a good way.
Well, wait a minute.
This.
I disagree here, and I think one thing that I think we can say is that we know that Putin has a little bit more, they have a little bit more, influence over when Syria makes decisions. As I think as we got closer, as the war drum started to beat, and the likelihood of military action started to happen, Putin sort of said, "Wait a minute, Barack Obama is serious about this." And he might go without the Congress. And I think at that point, that's when Putin said, wait a minute, we need to sort of, pump the brakes a little bit here.
I think that's one way to put it. But the bottom line is public support was not in favor of this. I think Obama was on his heels to begin with.
Well,
and honestly, I don't think his speech was delivered very, very well. Don't get me wrong. But I don't think it provided enough convincing arguments. Basically, he just said, "We've all seen the videos, and the videos are terrible."
No. I don't think I think the job of the president's speech was to provide a clear narrative of why we need to go.
But I don't think it was enough for the American people.
Well, it doesn't. But the thing is, the president doesn't need the American. Let's be real. The president doesn't need the American people to make this decision. He was elected by 51 million Americans to make these decisions.
I'll give you that, but
I'm not saying we should go or not. I'm just putting the facts out there.
I think that's a super weird. I don't know. If there was a Republican president, would you be making that argument? Absolutely not.
Well, George Bush just went to war. He went to war, and as much as I didn't like it, he went, and I support our troops.
Listen, I support our troops, but that doesn't mean I support going to war. I think those are two totally different things.
At the end of the day, I think, I hope we come to some sort of diplomatic resolution to this. I think now that Russia has engaged, the president can't go to war until we come to some sort of resolution on this possible diplomatic avenue.
Yeah, you're right about that, but the interesting thing about the Russia piece and why I think it was so strategic, ultimately, I don't think it's going to work, and I'm going to touch on that. But it was so strategic because one of President Obama's big promises was the non-proliferation and how he started to rebuild that relationship with Russia. And Putin knew that when he made this decision. And of course, Syria is going to be on board. And what it does for Russia is it allows them to keep their arms dealing that they have going on with the Assad regime going. And at the same time, it allows Assad to stay in power, which is...
Well, and I think that's the problem now. I think Assad, even if you disarm, but I see the thing is, and this is where I think the president went wrong, is that I think where I agree with John McCain, and I said this last week, is that if we're going to go in, there has to be a push towards regime change.
But we don't want to get stuck into the role of being the people
Well,
that have
I
to
hear
facilitate
that. I hear that. But if we're going to go in, we are there until we get regime change.
And when the United Nations, and I think that that's definitely a good point, when the United Nations takes a step back and isn't willing to acknowledge and play their part as, you know, who are supposed to be the peacekeepers, obviously America takes a proactive role in this. But this needs
let's
to
pause
be,
it on a second, because I think Ki Moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, made a statement a couple days ago indicating that, you know, that this was a collective failure to halt more than 2 years of atrocities and violence in Syria, and he expressed hope that the crisis over the country's chemical weapon stockpile will be the catalyst towards a diplomatic solution. So I think the UN is admitting that they took too long. But what I will say this president has done, and I heard a friend say it to me, and I really had to digest it for a second, is that for once in the world's history, world leaders have not been silent on the atrocities taking place in Syria. When Sudan happened, most of the world leaders were completely and utterly silent. Nobody said anything, right? And when Rwanda happened, nobody said anything. And President Obama has elevated the conversation that now they're talking about it at Buckingham Palace, they're talking about it at the Kremlin, they're talking about it at the White House, they're talking about it in Canada, they're talking about it in China. And he's elevated the conversation that all world leaders now have to deal with the decision that they're going to make in Syria. And this is the first time, I would say, in a very long time that we've seen these type of conversations elevated. And my hope is that now that we've elevated the conversation in Syria, when another atrocity happens, when another Sudan happens, when another Rwanda happens, this will be the same level of response, or at least, at minimum, the same level of dialogue.
I'll give you that. I agree with most of that. I think that we've used this idea of human rights as partial justification for a lot of wars that we've gotten into, which aren't necessarily true. Clearly, in this case, it's actually going on. The Iraq and Afghanistan war come to mind just off the top of my head. Obviously, there were other kind of excuses that we were throwing around during the Bush presidency for these wars. Some of which may or may not be, you know, differing degrees of truth about them. But we do see that used as a justification for going to war. But ultimately, I think what we're going to come down to is that on paper, turning the weapons over to the UN sounds like a great plan. It's like almost everyone's winning. Assad's winning because he gets to stay in power. Russia's winning, they get to sell him guns. The United States is winning because you wouldn't have to bomb people and kill people. But there are a lot of reasons why this isn't going to work. First of all, there's no way to be certain where they're hiding all these weapons.
Well, the hope is that Putin could go in and sort of say, "Hey, Assad, tell us where the weapons are."
Right, but realistically, easier said than done.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think if anybody's going to do it, Putin is the person that could do it.
To destroy the weapons.
No, the weapons. It's not about destroying them, but getting them under international control. And I think if there's any country,
no. International control is these weapons need to be destroyed on site. It's not like we can wheel them over to the UN headquarters and go blow them up in a cave somewhere.
I hear that, but I think if there's any country that could get them to sort of say where all the weapons are, it's going to be the Russians.
It's a tough piece when it's happening in the war zone, but I do think you're right about that. That's a good point. We got to leave it at that. We're coming up on the break. We'll definitely discuss more about this next week. We'll be right back on the Fowler Show.